Hello and welcome to our next reflection on the life of Saint Francis of Assisi. Yesterday we finished by reminding ourselves that Saint Francis ended up living with the lepers and serving them. But soon he began to work. What was his work? The first work that he did was to rebuild the church of San Damiano, was to restore this old ancient church. And in it you have a symbolic action, because Saint Francis essentially was called by the Lord to rebuild his church that he saw was falling into ruins. But that mission is far greater than simply rebuilding a physical church, a physical building. But that's how it began. St. Francis is trying to work out, well, what is the Lord asking me to do with my life? And so he rebuilds the church of San Damiano, which becomes in a few years' time a place where the poor ladies begin to live. Poor ladies led by Saint Clare, who was touched and converted through the preaching, through listening to Saint Francis's words. And so she and a number of other ladies begin to live this new radical way of life, dedicated to God, after the example of Saint Francis in this place. Saint Francis doesn't stop there. He goes to repair another church, and finally he moves on to the Portiuncula, a little church outside of Assisi dedicated to Our Lady of the Angels. Thomas of Celano tells us that he starts rebuilding this church about 3 years after his conversion. And so he arrives at this place out of devotion to Our Lady, out of devotion to the angels, and wishes to restore this little church. It will become the most important place for Francis and for his brothers until today, a treasured place. But it begins in humble situation, in humble surroundings, being abandoned, being left derelict. And so St. Francis comes to repair it, to restore it. This whole idea of Francis restoring what is already there. He is not building a new one. He is not building a new church in place of the other. He is not replacing the old one with a new one. He is building on this solid ancient foundation. And it's important for us to hold on to this, because when we talk about the renewal of the church, it's about building ourselves again on the solid ancient foundation that is already there. It never goes away, it never changes. All we need to do is to go back to the church, go back to her teachings, go back to the gospel, and live it faithfully. This is St. Francis's way of rebuilding the church. It's not about what the other people do. It's about how am I responding to the call of the gospel. It's about my journey, my conversion, that will in effect have this beautiful effect on those people around me, and in this way on the whole church. So St. Francis begins by rebuilding these churches, two of them so instrumental to the Franciscan family, San Damiano and the Portiuncula. He is listening to the gospel. He is trying to work out, well, what does the Lord want me to do? So far, he is wandering from one place to another, leading an austere way of life. But he stumbles across the gospel being read in the church. He listens to the gospel that talks about how the first disciples were sent out on the mission. Don't take anything for your journey. Don't wear shoes. Don't have a haversack. Don't have a spare tunic. Go in that total freedom. Go in total poverty, trusting that the Lord will provide for you. And when St. Francis listens to the Word of God, he is inspired. It's another conversion. It's another moment where the Lord speaks to him and draws his heart towards him. Because St. Francis's response to that message was, this is what I want, this is what I seek, this is what I desire. I want to lead this gospel way of life. And so he lets go of his shoes, he changes whatever clothing he had into a habit of whatever shape or form that had. But we know that his idea was to have that piece of clothing that would be in the shape of a cross. He has exchanged his leather belt that he used to wear into a cord round his waist. He is letting go of his shoes. He is reclothing himself. He is beginning a new identity. He has received another sense of purpose and direction from the gospel. Again, it's another piece of information for us that is important. The influence of the Word of God on each of us. The power of the Word of God on each of us. St. Francis heard this word and wanted it to be translated for him. He went to the priest afterwards and said, "Explain this to me. What does this mean?" He was eager to find out. And he responded to it wholeheartedly. And it's the same for us on our journey. We have different ways, or the Lord rather has different ways of speaking to us. And one most obvious way in which he does is through his word. But again, if I want to follow in the example, after the example of St. Francis, then I need to fall in love with the Word of God. Am I just as eager to listen to it? Am I just as eager to try to understand what it actually means in my daily life? How do I apply it? Who is this Lord who is calling me? Where do I go to find out more about it? Again, what judgments stop me or prevent me from listening to the Word of God? There is so many different things that we could be considering, even with that idea of the Word of God being so instrumental in our way of life, in our conversion. So St. Francis responds to it and goes about preaching. He goes about preaching really two things: announcing peace, the gift of peace to everybody, and preaching and calling people to a life of penance. The gift of peace, as we know from the scriptures, was the first gift that the Lord gave to his disciples after his resurrection. My peace I give you. That peace is meant to be at home within us. And the only way we can become instruments of peace is if we have peace, if we treasure that peace, if we look after our hearts to ensure that that peace remains with us. And simply by carrying this treasure within us, we will be able to pass it to other people. And the life of penance is all about a life that is turned towards God. It's about being centered on God. To lead a life of penance means to accept everything that comes to me as though it is coming from the hands of God. Not to allow myself to be sucked into these illusions that somehow things come to me from different people. No, God is above all this. God is the one who gives me everything. He is, remember, our Father in heaven who cares for us. And so peace and penance were the two things that Francis preached constantly. And people began to respond to his preaching. the first few brothers started to arrive. One notable among them, Brother Bernard of Quintivalli, a nobleman, high up in society, and yet through listening, through observing this man, remember this must be a number of years now after his conversion, and something is striking him about Francis and his way of life. And he decides, I want to join you. And so he gives everything that he has to the poor, not leaves it with the family, but he gives it to the poor. And he comes and joins Francis in this way of life. In this way of life that is very simple, about preaching penance, preaching peace, and trying to live this gospel message in their daily life. And so the numbers begin to grow, a few brothers at first. And so Francis begins to have companions who are with him. And Francis had a vision at that moment when there was so few of them. And the vision was about the growth of this brotherhood, about the growth of these few people who have come to join him. Because Francis was beginning to be wondering, well, what do we do? How do these people come to me? What do I tell them? What do they need to do? And so in this vision, in this prayer time, Francis sees that many people will come. He mentions the French, the English, the Spaniards, people from different nations coming to join this brotherhood. And so he told them to give thanks and to rejoice, because through these humble beginnings, something great will occur. And with time, it will change. It will not be as beautiful as it was at the beginning. And that's the vision, that's the experience of Francis, which has come true, which probably is still coming true even at this stage. But nonetheless, this vision remains true of people from different nations joining them. And so when there were 8 friars, 8 brothers living together, Francis decides to separate them into pairs. He joins with another brother, and those 4 pairs go into different parts of the world, simply to spread this message. And then they come back together, rejoicing that the Lord inspired them to come back, to share their experience, to share what has happened along the way, along the journey. And the numbers continue to grow. The numbers then increase to 12. And those 12 simple people, simple men, according to Thomas of Celano, already their fame is spreading throughout the area. Their way of life, their message is already striking the people around them. And so the journey continues with those 12 apostles. And so we also need to be encouraged with small things. The work of the Lord begins very humbly within each of our hearts, almost hidden. Look how many years it took for Francis, from that initial call, to end up in this position, before any brother came to live with him. He simply got on with his work faithfully, as best as he could, rebuilding the churches, responding in his own way to the gospel way of life. He wasn't seeking followers. He was seeking the gospel. He was seeking the Lord himself. And that's what we are asked to do in our life. It's not about having big numbers following you. It's about you being faithful to the Lord in your daily life. Amen.